Hi, everybody. Well, good afternoon. It is afternoon and it's inclusive world, yay! And you are in the intersection of compliance and inclusion. Woo woo! I'm your moderator, Robin Romano. I'm the CEO of Moderator Federal Credit Union in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm also a District 4 board member for Inclusiv. My fun fact for me is that I am a former EVIL NCUA examiner. Don't hold it against me. I've seen the light. So, a few housekeeping rules today. I just want to say that all of the sessions are recorded. You will be able to get them in about 2 weeks. The recordings will be accessible in the same way you accessed the session through the conference, and later also on the Inclusiv website. So as you've been told all day, please keep your speakers on mute so that we don't have to hear crying babies and barking dogs. And I hope my dog doesn't bark in the back. We encourage you to put your view on speaker for this particular conference or this section for the breakout, because as you can see, we do have a slideshow. But if you prefer to see everybody, you can put it on grid view. We are going to make time to have questions and answers at the end of this session. As you've been seeing, you can use your chat. So use the chat function to put your questions. We are going to monitor the chat and try to get to everybody's questions at the end. We will also have our speakers asking for comments. We hope that you will participate. Hey, for all you social media savvies, hashtag CDCUCON 2020 is where you need to go put out all the really cool information about what you've been learning. So let's get started on the intersection of compliance and inclusion. I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. First, the speakers will be going together. Our first speaker, Kenia Calderon Ceron. She's the Client Relations Director for Coopera. Coopera, I was going to say that wrong, I knew I would, who partners with credit unions to create and execute strategies to grow membership and connect with them in the Hispanic community. As a Salvadorian immigrant, she has been a tireless advocate for Latinos, undocumented community, and those with deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACAs. In 2017, she was named Woman to Watch by Credit Union Times. Our other speaker is Erin. She is the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for PolicyWorks. She supports PolicyWorks national partnerships through consulting support in areas of governance, risk, and compliance. Before joining PolicyWorks, she worked for the Iowa Legal Aid, handling a variety of civil law matters. She got her degree from the University of Iowa College of Law, and she has over 10 years of experience working with the credit union regulatory issues. So ladies, the presentation is yours.
Thank you so much, Robin. It's also an honor to have you be our moderator because you bring a great deal of knowledge in regards of compliance and inclusion as well. So I'm excited to learn from you during this presentation. And I guess since you had a fun fact about you, I can do one of me too. Erin, does that sound good? So you better think of one, a very fun one. I think a fun fact for me is I think this pandemic has forced us all to go out of our comfort zone. And so this pandemic turned me into a baker. So I have baked about 10 different birthday cakes for family members. And I had never baked in my life before. So if you have any tips, we can touch base later on offline for me as I continue my journey as a baker. Erin, any fun fact for you?
You know, I don't know if we're going to use the term fun loosely here, but an interesting fact, I do have a special place in my heart for disaster recovery plans and products that credit unions offer because I have been in both a tornado, an earthquake, and a flood all within short periods of time. And so I certainly can appreciate the need and the benefits of those. It really changed my perspective. So just a little interesting fact there to kick us off.
I like it. I like it. Yeah. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us to have this conversation about the intersection of compliance and inclusion. So together, let me see. right now. Perfect. We have a few objectives that we drafted for you all, and you may be coming with a different goal of your own too. So feel free to incorporate that into a question as well. But together today, we're going to learn how to foster and integrate a culture of compliance and inclusion, address the roadblocks, and identify key ways to support your growth objectives, incorporate compliance into your organization's offerings for underserved markets, and lastly, utilize compliance to ensure safety and soundness while serving the underserved. And when Erin and I were thinking of what topic was relevant for you all, our jobs are very different, yet we collaborate a lot when it comes to compliance. We found that when we talk about inclusion, we have found that some credit unions fear bringing the compliance team on board. And sometimes we think we'll include them later on, or we're just making the plan right now. We'll have that conversation when we start talking about product development. And so we have found that there are many ways to be successful as we include compliance and inclusion. So we're curious, so we have a poll question for you all. What is your role at your credit union? So we want to get to know you a little bit better. So we'll have a poll here for you all to answer.
You know, and while folks are taking their time to answer that, I'd just say, Kenia, that's exactly right, you know, with those objectives that you outlined there. And I think as we're kind of kicking off this presentation, the tone that we want to start in the message, you know, if you walk away with nothing else, is that we're really approaching this from the point of opportunity. You know, compliance, we have heard a lot of hesitancy, you know, as we work with folks across the country, as they grow their financial inclusion programs and initiatives and work with their entire community. You know, compliance always seems to be a sticking point. And what we really want to do is remove that barrier, make sure that's not an obstacle that's holding anything up. Absolutely, if there's one message to take away is that, you know, compliance, yes, we do have to follow it. We have to pay attention to safety and soundness, but there is a way to serve all of our members in a compliant way.
Yes, for sure. So let's see if we can take a look at, okay, great. So we have a good mixture. We have the majority of folks joining us, community outreach and engagement individuals. So compliance, I'm sure it's not your area of expertise, but right, we're always out looking for ways to learn more. So thank you all so much for joining us. And no lending, folks, which is okay. So we'll encourage you and ask you to take this information over to your lending department. Perfect. So something that I do on a daily basis, and Erin, I'm sure we're always on the phone through Zoom, having conversations with different credit unions across the United States. And we have found that there is a right way to approach inclusion, especially as it relates to underserved markets. So thinking, and I'm going to ask all of you to reflect on your credit union and if you have built the right organizational mentality. If that's something you can check off your list, then we're at a great start. So in order for us to be successful, we need to build the right organizational mentality. Then we can start diving into what does market inclusion look like? So if you have a segment that you want to bring on board, at times it's hard for us to really determine where's the first step? What do we need to tackle first? So for true inclusion, something that we encourage our credit unions that we work with very closely is to take a look at 4 different areas of their credit union, because inclusion will need to be part of those decisions, will need to be part of a planning session. So inclusion could start with personnel, having individuals that understand the membership that you're trying to serve, but also reflect the community that you're trying to serve as well is extremely important. Our second place to look at for inclusion practices is products. So we'll dive into that a little bit later with Erin in regards to what are some of those considerations, compliance considerations to keep in mind. Processes is another important aspect to make sure that before you approach the market, that you have done some work internally to make sure that, one, folks are on board. Two, is that they understand what changes will take place in the credit union and how to communicate those to your new members. And then lastly, we can dive into promotion and marketing. My recommendation based on my my type of work is that sometimes when credit unions are eager to serve a different segment of their field of membership, we want to dive into promotion and marketing right away. So we have an idea, we know who we want to attract, but I would encourage you to take a look at the 3 other areas before we dive into promotion and marketing, translating our documents, because once we jump into promotion and marketing, we're setting a set of expectations that if we haven't done the work among our staff, products, or processes, we may not be able to meet those expectations, and we don't want to build or create bad reputation among the community that you're trying to serve. So for us, it's really looking into a holistic approach to serve this community.
Yeah, and Kenia, that's a great example of where, even though we have very different jobs, how sometimes this overlaps. As Kenia does an amazing job working with credit unions, talking about that process, how to really build that organizational mentality. And when you look at that last step, that promotion and marketing, she's right. When you skip to the end, when you skipped right to your marketing pieces, translating documents, things like that, that's really where we see compliance risk go up, right? Is when you kind of skip these other talking about. So it's a great kind of overlap point to kind of make sure that we're mitigating our risks as you would serving any group or launching any product, that you're starting at the beginning to really build the foundation there that she's talking about.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. That's a great point. And so we're probably going to be saying underserved markets like 100 times during this presentation, and you probably have heard this term throughout the entire conference. So I think it's important for us to take a step back too and realize that underserved markets can mean many different things for many different individuals, depending on your field of membership. Every single field of membership is different. So I'm going to ask you, using the chat box, to tell me, when you think of underserved markets, what comes to mind? For me, when I think of underserved markets, I think of the undocumented community, because I'm a DACA recipient and most of my family members are undocumented. So that's top of mind for me. Erin, who or what segment of the population comes to mind when you think of underserved markets?
Yeah, great question. And, certainly there are different segments that come to mind too. And some of those are really about what those individuals may be experiencing. So folks that may be experiencing homelessness, folks that may be experiencing domestic violence at home, others may be recently incarcerated and trying to kind of reintegrate into the community. So both kind of different segments of the population, but also folks that are experiencing some of these common situations as well.
Yeah, for sure. Robin, based on your field of membership, who comes to mind when you think of underserved markets?
Well, actually, what I like to call as financial deserts, areas in your community where there is no bank or credit union. All there is title loan, cash check places, Title Max, Cash Time, those kinds of places. Our credit union actually moved right smack dab in the middle of one. We are the only financial institution in a 5-mile radius in some area for that. So financial desert.
Thank you, Robin. To be honest, I've never thought of financial deserts, but if I think back, you just made me think of where I lived when my family had recently migrated to the United States. It was a financial desert. I don't think we had any credit unions, but we did have check cashing places. We had grocery stores where they cashed their checks, and pawn shops. There were a ton of pawn shops by where we lived. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Other underserved markets that I'm seeing come through the chat is Black, Indigenous, POC, people of color communities. Excellent. Undocumented, unbanked, and underbanked, credit invisibilities. financial deserts in Barney's area, which is in Seattle, are primarily people of color, Black, Indigenous, or people of color, students, elderly, great point then, and other individuals that visit pawn shops, refugees, low-income families, residents of public housing, and folks with disability too. One that I'm not seeing come through the chat is our LGBTQ community as well. So our transgender community is also a community that's underserved. So thank you all so much for your feedback. So thinking of underserved markets, I really encourage us to go beyond what we know and what we see in our field of membership too, and figure out, are there communities that we could be further excluding if we don't do the work to learn a little bit about what their needs are and how we can help. So, perfect. So the intersection of compliance and inclusion. So what we mean is that compliance and inclusion, there is a partnership to be formed there. So, and sometimes we're asking, when do we start, or when do we bring compliance into the conversation? So I've been a consultant. So I've been working with credit unions for almost 5 years. And I noticed that our compliance folks were not joining us during the planning session, that we would have the conversation about how to grow among the Hispanic community. And so I allowed that fear to happen for about maybe 2 to 3 years. But what I noticed is that when compliance individuals or compliance experts were not part of the planning session, when we set objectives for our Hispanic members, that we did have to have ongoing conversations later on. It's almost like working backwards. So for the last 3 years now, we have been inviting our compliance experts at the very beginning of these conversations. So now they are joining us for planning sessions in regards of like setting different objectives. And I can't tell you how wonderful this experience and how much that has changed and improved the inclusion process. So it does start at the very beginning when you start to have conversation and the exploration phase of who is your underserved market that you want to serve. And then when you get into the development and outreach piece, you have mitigated risk because your compliance folks have been able to provide you with input and guidance from the very beginning. So we have another quick question here. How often do you incorporate the compliance and risk staff in your financial inclusion planning?
And these are all anonymous. We know everyone's coming from a different situation. So everyone's at a different point and everyone has a different compliance structure. So it's just a good starting point to feel out, where the conversation begins.
Yeah. Perfect. Let's see the results. All the time. Great. Awesome. So right now we have, I think like 40% of you all the time and 36% of you sometimes. So I think it's a good mixture, Erin. I think you're right. We all come from different places. I'm happy that we didn't have anyone answer never because we would be very concerned. But I think we're starting at a very good point here. Perfect. So I will hand it over to Erin.
Yeah, and if you want to click through, some of these, just want to start with some of these key service areas. So as we're thinking about compliance and where it intersects with reaching underserved markets and broadening your financial inclusion initiatives, really want to make sure that we're thinking through some of those key areas where there are compliance considerations at any stage, regardless of what your initiative is. We want to be mindful of that account opening process and really thinking through what is not only that member experience, are we getting to know our member in a way that sets us up for success and complies with the regulations? Certainly anytime we're advertising, thinking about those account services, folks come with a different level of understanding about how different financial institutions work and overdraft services, cashing checks, things like that. And one too, in the lending side that I think sometimes can be overlooked is thinking through, if it does come to this, what are those collection or loss mitigation options? But just some key areas to be thinking about that we know the regulations will impact here as we kind of move on to the next area. So when we think about, let's talk about where to begin here. And Kenia did a great job of sharing those real life examples about how she kind of changed her method as she was talking to credit unions and really encouraged them to invite the compliance person to the table to have those conversations from the very beginning. And I would point out too that the compliance folks, you know, they're going to be coming at it from a different angle, right? They're going to be, they might have a different mindset. So there may be a journey too, an education journey, making sure that those that are working in community outreach that really know the different communities that are represented within their fields of membership, to ensure that that information is shared with the compliance person so that they can kind of share that educational role, learning about the community engagement folks, sharing that information with the compliance team, and the compliance folks sharing where those regulations could come up through those products and service suggestions. One quick tip that can be implemented right away. I know during COVID, budgets are tight, right? And we want to think about what can we do right away to take a concrete step. And so one area too, you know, there's lots of different ways to identify any gaps that may be in your processes, procedures, or gaps in those service areas. I know a lot of folks do a great job of partnering with community organizations to learn more about what their community needs, but also asking the compliance and risk folks who are probably doing this anyway, and it can strengthen your foundation overall for your entire credit union, is to really make sure that you're reviewing any complaints that are coming in, looking for trends, looking for incidents where perhaps folks had trouble accessing services, where they weren't able to open an account. You know, what was it that prevented them from opening an account? Was it not understanding what forms of identification needed to be provided, not being able to read the disclosures? You know, there's lots of different reasons that could come up, and potentially a complaint area is a great way to kind of screen and get a high level view of some of those potential trends that could be going on at your credit union. And that's—
yeah, Erin, and I think,
oh, go ahead.
yes, I think you bring up a very good point. Complaint logs, I think, is something that we forget about if we're not, if we don't work in the compliance or regulation department, right? So a conversation that happens often with my credit union partners is this conversation about the membership experience. And so we're always asking ourselves, in our case, our Hispanic members, what does their Hispanic membership experience look like? Do we need to adjust a few things? So if we have folks from our compliance team involved, they have the data that we can utilize to make sure that our membership experience for our underserved segment is actually aligned with what our goals are too. And if we need to make certain adjustments, because for underserved markets, you are going to have to make sure that your membership experience, it may have to differ a little bit than what you have for your dominant or your long-term members too. So I think that's super important to remember about.
Absolutely. It's that other point of intersection, right? Where member experience and compliance overlap, and what you can learn from each of those, and making sure you're monitoring on an ongoing basis. This can change over time. Obviously, the makeup of your field of membership can change, and are you adapting? Can really show through with some of these complaint logs. And the other benefit there, as I'm sure Robin could attest to, mitigating those and recognizing those in advance of your exam, and preparing and having shown how you documented changes to prevent these complaints from happening again, sets you up for success from a compliance and exam perspective as well.
Absolutely.
We'll go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've got one last poll question here for the group. So what is the biggest compliance challenge you're facing when serving those underserved markets within your own community? So we'll give everyone just a couple of minutes to answer this poll question. And again, recognizing folks are going to be coming from, you know, a different place. And so this could be a wide range. There's no right answer on this one. It's going to be different for folks. All right. We'll see if folks have had a chance to answer and see those results. Interesting that resistance from compliance and risk team is at the top, not by a large margin, but certainly something that we can see that folks are facing. And that you're not alone in that. You know, there are others in that same situation, which is another great reason we wanted to talk about this particular topic. Following the requirements of the regulations in general, and certainly meeting those requirements to open accounts. It's a good spread of equal answers across there. So thanks everyone for sharing that feedback, and hopefully this will inform our Q&A section here coming up in just a little bit as well. Okay, so one piece that I do want to mention, and this is a conversation that I have, whether it's directly with a compliance person, kind of speaking compliance person to compliance person, or whether I'm talking to senior management or community outreach folks, it's important to know where your true risk lies. And if people are having separate conversations and not talking to each other, you may come up with different reasons or different thoughts about where is our risk when it comes to compliance. Is it that we're violating an actual regulation? Is it that we're worried about credit risk? Is it that we're worried about default rates? Items like that. And I think what we've experienced working with different credit unions across the country is that those different components, people are surprised once they start working together and incorporating compliance, so compliance can learn from the community outreach folks and vice versa. You realize that your true risk most often falls with making sure that there's communication between the departments and that you've prepared properly for any new products or services and to be able to serve all of the communities within your field of membership. So a couple of quick examples, making sure those policies and procedures match your actual day-to-day practices. So can't tell you, sometimes the regulation actually has more flexibility than you think it does. But because your policy says something different that's a little bit more specific or more narrow because it was written 5-10 years ago when your field of membership looked a little bit different, you're not violating the actual regulation, but you are violating your policy. So when the examiner comes in and sees that, for example, your BSA and CIP policy said you have to collect a tax identification number issued from the US government form of issued IDs from the US government, where the regulation says it has to be issued by a government, could be a passport or some other form from a foreign government. But because your policy was more restrictive, you actually then may have been out of compliance because you accepted a passport from someone, even though the regulation allows it, your policy didn't. So making sure you're having those conversations, of course, training staff. Look, this is, no one's fault. It's always difficult, regardless of the situation. If there's a member service rep or a teller that's faced with a situation they've never been faced with, and they didn't have any training on the situation, they didn't know what to do, that is where there can be a huge risk of then kind of going off script, right? Acting outside of the process because they don't know what to do in that particular situation. So preparing and reviewing those policies and procedures, making sure they match that day to day, is a great area to make sure that you're identifying where that true risk is, because it's not always where you think it is.
Yeah, and Erin, I think that it makes me think of the staff training that is needed to make sure that as we serve underserved markets, unless you have been part of an underserved market, it might be a little bit hard to understand what that feeling is when you walk into a credit union. So as I mentioned, I'm a DACA recipient, so I grew up going to the credit union with my parents. Both of them are I-10 holders. And it's a very vulnerable process to be able to go to a credit union and almost, out yourself for whatever situation you may be. And there were times where staff looked at my parents like they didn't know what to do with them, right? Even though they opened accounts with I-10, they did I-10 lending, but if your staff isn't well trained, you could be making members feel like more uncomfortable than what they already are, but also you make them feel unwelcomed because they're sitting across from you and you're looking at their paperwork and you're looking at them freaking out because you really don't know what to do with them. And so that creates a negative experience, something to be mindful of. So staff training is extremely important. And thinking back at the poll, we had folks that say that there is some resistance from their compliance folks. I want us to be mindful that we're all in a learning curve. So something that I encounter with compliance folks when they're thinking of accepting alternative forms of ID, for example, compliance folks may need a little bit of background or information to understand why individuals don't have a social security number. So maybe a training on immigration overview is important. That has made a huge impact in the past. So know that while our compliance folks do have the expertise in many different areas, we need to be able to provide them with that learning opportunity in other areas that maybe our outreach folks are very well versed in.
You know, that's a great point, Kenia, too, and another place of intersection, right, where this all kind of comes together, where you could have a member that has both a bad experience and now the credit union's just violated accidentally their policy and you have a compliance risk there. But that point about, you know, meeting people where they are in it is a journey is absolutely right. You know, I will tell you, I speak at a lot of compliance conferences and I've attended a lot over the years and worked with different folks. And this is not a common topic, talking about the nuances of the regulation, about what to do in maybe less common situations does not come up in a lot of those compliance, typical and mainstream compliance conferences that your staff may be attending or maybe learning from. And so it's kind of that pulling them in, asking them, you know, we said this earlier on, asking them to be a champion of this cause of broadening the financial inclusion, because it does take some extra reading, some extra learning on the compliance person's part. But I think the more they learn and the more they know about what's going on within the community and having the chance to look at the regulations and compare how they can get to an answer of yes, really gives compliance folks a bit more confidence knowing that, okay, we've identified some of these issues and learned about some of these new areas.
I just wanted to interject in experience. When I first started to go into the Hispanic market, I actually talked to immigration officials. I had them come in. We discussed what kinds of different kinds of IDs were available. I want to remind everybody out there that you can buy books on international driver's license that also include matriculas from a wide variety of countries. And you need to use those to help educate your staff to know what it looks like. What does a matricula look like from Mexico or from Honduras or from wherever it may be from? So take an opportunity. There's a lot of resources out there. Sorry for the interjection, but I thought this was a good spot for it.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And that's great feedback, Robin, too, because really, you know, the compliance person's thinking, we have this responsibility, right? Bank Secrecy Act says we have to form a reasonable belief that the person is who they say they are. So if someone's being presented with an ID that they've never seen before, that they don't have any information on, how are they supposed to detect whether it's fraudulent or not? And so, like you said, there are great training resources out there that are staying up to date with any changes. And so knowing that community and knowing what common forms of identification may be coming through and having materials if a less common one comes through, you're still able to meet that compliance burden of checking for that fraudulent, forming that reasonable belief through different documentary methods, through learning about what different IDs look like, but then also serving the community and preparing them in advance to have a good experience, as Kenia was talking about. So that's great. Yeah. I think we'll go ahead and take a look here. So this is really, you know, we're just talking high level about where these intersection points are and how we can really integrate the compliance team in there and the benefits of doing that early on. So this is not an all-inclusive list, but it is a comprehensive list, but just to give folks a sense of there are lots of regulations that are going to be impacted. And that's not just because we're talking about underserved markets. It's just the way of the world at the moment, right? Anytime you're doing any sort of loan to anyone, opening an account to anyone, there are regulatory impacts, right? And so when you think about these are common regulations that are out there. I know it's a lot of just abbreviations for folks that may not be working in these day to day, but really it's just a list to give folks a sense of it's a lot of ground for a compliance person to cover, right? So as much opportunity as you can give them, joining them in that conversation early so they know whether is there, for example, UDAP, an unfair, deceptive, abusive acts or practices risk, where there might be some confusion as we're going to market with a different marketing piece. Are we doing loans under the ability to repay? What does that mean for our underwriting? There's lots of different state laws that can come into effect that you have to learn about. So I think 9 to 12 states in the US have their own consumer credit codes. You have to think about contractual requirements. So some states, if you started in that marketing piece, you may need to be able to provide different contracts and follow-up disclosures in that other language. So lots to consider. One piece I don't want to overlook though, and especially for compliance folks that may be newer to learning about this area and really thinking about the regulations through a different lens, that may have been hesitant in the past about, I don't know if this meets the regulation. You know, I always try to get folks to think about it broadly too, because I think, you know, I think folks that know me will attest that I am naturally a risk averse person. I work in compliance for a reason. But I think there's a lot of risk on the other side too, if you're not proactively trying to serve underserved members or preparing your staff to be able to do so. So take the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, for example. Don't overlook those equal lending regulations where folks may come in and ask to apply for a loan, and if the staff is uncomfortable or it's a new situation, or they may be talking to them about their situation, they may accidentally discourage them for applying for that loan because they didn't have the training, they didn't have the products and services that were offered. And now you just increased your risk of violating the regulation on the other side. So I can totally appreciate folks that are trying to be mindful of the regulations, but I do think that the safest approach is to really, and the correct approach to that credit unions are set up for, is to serve the entire community and really prepare for that and prepare their staff for it. All right. And we'll go ahead and take a look. So now we put just these next couple, as we're kind of wrapping up this section, I'm going to move into some questions. I want to put just a couple of examples. There's lots out there, but since we've been talking at a little bit more of a higher level and a strategic level, just some concrete examples. You know, we've mentioned the Bank Secrecy Act in the past and your customer or member identification program and those considerations that go along with it. We've certainly talked a little bit about looking at and understanding different forms of ID. So when we're thinking about those key pieces of information that you have to collect for everyone, right? You think about the name, the date of birth, certainly the identification and the tax identification number. But the other piece too is the address, and the regulation wants everyone to be able to provide a physical address. So folks, especially as we're heading into economic uncertainty with what's going on in the world today too, there are lots of different situations where someone either long-term or very short-term may experience homelessness, but having a bank account, having an account at a credit union is critical to not only ensure their kind of financial stability, but be able to access different support services throughout kind of this unprecedented time. And so making sure we're thinking about that. This, for example, is another area where I think folks are surprised that there's a little bit of flexibility within the regulation, where you are able to, yes, you do have to have a physical address on file, but you can look at potentially looking at that next of kin or another contact of that individual to be able to open that account for them. This doesn't have to be a barrier if they don't have a physical address of their own. There are other opportunities to look at other addresses that can be used. Now, you want to be prepared for this. This is another situation where preparation is key too. Does staff know what your process and procedure is and how you're going to go about having that conversation so the member also has a good experience and you're staying within your compliance regulations? But this is another area too that is just an example that we've seen come up this year, actually, more so maybe than in the past. Maybe taking a look at the next one real quick, you know, as we're getting a little bit close to our Q&A section here. So just one other example that comes up quite frequently that I'm sure folks have heard at their credit union, thinking about how do we lend to members, especially those that may not be US citizens. So are we taking into account, have we done a holistic look at what underwriting criteria? So, you know, we can get pretty set in our ways, I think, and have we taken a look recently at what sort of documentation, what sort of income information are we asking to underwrite the loan, right? Everyone wants to make sure that we're putting the member in a loan that's good for them, that they have the ability to repay. But how are we going through that process? Are we able to actually capture the true amount of their income? Do we know what their history of repayment is and what their other debts are? Because as we know, the credit score can sometimes be a bit deceptive there, and folks are coming in from different situations. So that's not always the most reliable. And so are we thinking broadly about what those underwriting criteria are? And this is another great just example of where the compliance person can be brought into the conversation early. Again, they may come in already a champion and ready to go and happy to be able to set up the process from the beginning, or they may need a bit of time to learn more about the community, what types of income we're seeing from members, and to be able to have that research opportunity to really structure it properly. All right. So again, we'll move through this pretty quick where we understand everyone's starting from a different spot. So I think if there's, a place to begin is to know and take inventory of where are you at. So some folks do compliance through an individual department. Some have it set up compliance by committee where the heads of departments are responsible for their own compliance. And there are a lot of folks where the CEO is just wearing a lot of hats, right? And they have to be the compliance person too. So step one is really taking that inventory of where are we at, and being mindful that we're on a journey together. Compliance folks hate saying no. Like, I don't want to say no to folks that you can't do something. They want to find a way to get to yes, but in order to do that, they have to be part of that conversation early. All right. So can you put together here just a quick slide on thinking through just where do we go from here? Some steps to take away after we leave this conference and this conversation. So knowing that fields of membership, Kenia spoke about this at the beginning, making sure you understand what those underserved market groups are, those characteristics, be able to prepare your staff and have that conversation with the compliance and risk team, be able to educate them. They're spending their days reading, different regulations in different ways, and they're not out there in the community as often as maybe the community folks are, or folks that are working on the teller line that have more interaction with members. So make sure you're sharing that information with them as well. And then documenting those compliance implications, making sure that we're demonstrating, again, to examiners. Really, I think the risk of compliance goes up when you're not preparing and you're not documenting, you're not having those conversations. When you do, when you're prepared and folks know what their process is and that you can show that you did account for those compliance regulations, in that situation, we really haven't heard much pushback at all from examiners. It's really when you're kind of caught unprepared. So we said at the beginning, you might have skipped to the marketing piece without those other steps that I spoke about at the beginning. And then making sure, again, as you're going through that execution plan, there should be a spot on that roadmap for the compliance person to say, okay, well, we do need to update. Turns out our BSA policy is a bit out of date and doesn't really conform to what we need it to be. And so that's got to go to the board. So we're going to need, to be part of that execution roadmap and make sure we've got the time and the voice to be able to make those adjustments.
All right. So I did see a couple of questions, or at least one here about, are there strategies, recommendations to create peer-to-peer CU compliance connections? I think that's a terrific question. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, that is a great question. And so I would, I'll invite the others to everyone else to jump in as well to see what's worked for them, and everyone on the call too. If you have strategies that you've utilized, please put those in the chat so we can all learn from each other. I think having, there are compliance roundtables out there, leagues host different compliance roundtables, different smaller chapter organizations for financial institutions host different groups of folks that will gather together. So look at those existing networking opportunities, but I would say make sure you've got that you're prepared. So it's great to have a compliance person in the room or someone like Kenia or Robin who has experience working with underserved markets that can help join that conversation as well. Because if it's just a group of compliance folks that have never looked at this issue before, the conversation may not be hearty and robust as it would be otherwise. So, one strategy to employ would be to look at those existing networking opportunities or chapter gatherings, other conferences, and then invite someone, that has a lot of experience working with underserved markets to help join that conversation and really help direct and provide some additional information there.
Yeah. Erin, I think that's a great idea. I mean, you can call Kenia. She's a good resource for that. But actually, if you're serving in your markets, contact some of the nonprofits or other CDFIs. You remember, not every CDFI is a credit union. There are loan funds out there, and they probably have some really terrific information about what their who they're serving and so forth, and how to ID them. Loan funds can only lend, they can't take deposits. Kenia?
Yeah.
Right.
I think for me,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Was there another question? Because I had a
No,
quick
I was
note about.
I said, can I chime in on that questions as far as the peer-to-peer?
Mhm.
Also, working with Inclusive, I also work in compliance and have the opportunity to work with a lot of our credit unions, a lot of our MDI credit unions and CDFI credit unions. So as far as networking and peering with credit unions, that's a great opportunity for our member credit unions to reach out to other credit unions, because we do have a large number of MDI credit unions and low-income credit unions within our field membership that does serve this type of community. So it's a great opportunity to tap into your network at Inclusive to reach out to these credit unions to find opportunity to peer with them.
Absolutely.
Yes, and that was alongside of what I was thinking too. So when I think of peer-to-peer relationship, I think of the Juntos Avanzamos network. So especially, you know, I think that's over 100 credit unions that have taken a pledge and have done the work to be truly inclusive of the Latino community. But I'm sure that they have best practices as it relates to other underserved markets as well. So looking at Inclusive and the Juntos Avanzamos credit, the Juntos Avanzamos family, I think it's a great place to start for peer-to-peer relationships.
Yeah, you know, and the one thing I might tag on to that there too is, especially in that peer-to-peer conversation, connecting and identifying those compliance champions too. Sometimes compliance folks speak a little bit of a different language, and you know, they have different concerns. I know Andrea's smiling because it can be true there. You know, I think Inclusive and PolicyWorks and Copera and Filene did a roadshow on ITIN lending last year, and I had someone come up at the end of my regulatory section that was part of the marketing and community outreach team. And they said, you know, I really appreciated that. I can't say that, you know, I followed all of the specific regulatory, but I have my compliance person on the phone. I'd like you to just quickly tell them that, you know, we talked about some of these regulations and we're going to send over the information so they can take a look at it. So there is that kind of component of finding those compliance champions too. They're out there and they want to be helpful and they want to use those regulations and that safety and soundness knowledge that they've gathered over the years to help move these. So that can be a great tool, and also, you know, reaching out to those other compliance folks that may be newer to that sort of initiative to help the conversation along.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that you guys, ladies talked about was taking a look at your policies, lending policies. Do you have what you need? You know, I see in the comments that many of you serve, you know, people who of modest means or people in public housing or a wide, you know, low income families. So, you know, you need to make sure that your policies reflect debt to income ratios that are realistic for the people that you are serving. And that may mean that you're going to accept, and I'm laughing because, you know, again, former NCUA examiner here, oh my God, your debt to income ratios may be greater than 50%. That can be justified if you're doing what these ladies are suggesting and making sure you're getting your homework done. Kenya?
No, I think I was just going to throw it for the team because we do have a next examiner to see if anyone that joined us would have any specific questions for Robin as well too. So please enter that in the chat box. We still have a few more minutes to be able to have a conversation with the next examiner too. It's a great opportunity.
So, Yep. So do we have any additional questions that you may have about different kinds of ID or changing in policy or loan products that you might want to put out there? You know, we always encourage you guys to put out small, you know, balanced loans, you know, that can be competitive against those payday and title lending, you know, the short term. You don't have to use PAL. You certainly can use other products that you want to do, as well as having products that are specific to needs, working with other groups within your community to meet the needs of what you of your membership base. You know, I'd also like to say a strong support is that the session prior to this on the plenary talked about savings. Don't forget, we are the queens of saving products, of borrowing off of savings or requiring forced savings. Don't forget, we can offer those products, and those products are not frequently offered at banks.
You know, one thing is folks are thinking of questions that, you know, we may not have touched on directly here, but Robin, you brought up a good point of with the policies and procedures and taking a look at those. You know, we mentioned a little bit how your field of membership can change over time, right? The demographics can change, the situation can change. During this unprecedented kind of year that we've had too, we've also seen quite a few regulatory changes. We've seen the NCUA take great steps too on additional flexibility and understanding that loss mitigation options may need to look a little different, and those factors may be approached a little bit differently than in the past. And I think we're headed into that sort of period for quite some time here. And so just another great reason to incorporate some of those compliance conversations early, because not only can they help set up, you know, for where you're at today, they can help prepare and monitor those ongoing changes. So it's a great combination. If you've got community engagement folks that are really watching what's going on in your community, that are talking to those community organizations and partnering with nonprofits to keep an eye on how your field of membership and those needs may be changing, while your compliance person's also keeping an eye on how those regulations may change and how there could be additional flexibility or just new rule updates that need to be considered as you're walking through this.
Absolutely. I'm curious, how many of you can put it in the chat, offer you know, loan documents and applications in a language that is not English? Do many of you do that? I'm waiting to see some chat.
And remember, she's a former examiner, so there's no risk. You're not current.
That's right. I haven't been with them in a really long time. Don't worry. I see a no. Implemented Spanish disclosures at Bank of the West for mortgage and HELOC. Excellent. English only, we do. You know, there are tons of companies now that are starting to offer in other languages, especially Spanish. A lot of the mortgage documents, the initial application and other things are offered in Spanish. And I know many of you serve other groups of refugees that may need a different language and so forth. So can I just really encourage you to try to offer at least initial stuff and to do that. Let's see, Zach says we're in the process of translating docs at Green State into Spanish and finding a huge number. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff to document. Helpful hint, at least 4 people who speak that language need to review it so that you can listen to them all argue about, no, it's this word that needs to be used.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Robin, too. So the accuracy of those translations, not all translators and interpreters are created equal, for sure. But also being mindful to, you know, when you're starting this process, have a plan going in, because, you know, just translating one document and not another can be confusing for folks. So making sure you're being really strategic about that process. And I will have to hand it to both the CFPB and NCUA. And if you haven't looked at their websites lately, they do offer a lot of resources in other languages, and both the NCUA and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau have member facing or customer facing web pages in other languages. So just like the NCUA has information for consumers to look at, how do I know about Share Insurance Fund and are my savings protected? They have that in Spanish as well, which is also another great resource to be providing to the members. So some of that legwork on translating some of those kind of financial literacy or basic understanding with regulatory components has already been done by the regulators. And anytime you can use like a model form or something from the regulators, I'm always a fan, because, you know, it's already been approved and the examiners aren't going to look at that too closely.
Well, we have a credit union here, community credit union. We hope to do more language in the future, such as in Portuguese and Somali. So there's a couple credit unions out here who speak a lot of languages, which is wonderful. And I'm trying to translate documents. Well, we need to start wrapping things up because you guys are going to be off to another session here. Thank you so much to Erin and to Kenia for a wonderful session. I hope that people learn things. Information is up on the screen. If you wanted to ask me a question, I'll give you my email. Robin, ROBINR @Marisol, MARISOLCU.org. So anyways, we're going to be taking a quick break here for intermission, about 15 minutes or so, and come back together for our next plenary. And that is a hard word to say, guys. Session, when we hear about the role of community development credit unions playing in combating climate change and building a more equitable financial landscape. I think we're going to hear some about this new program where credit unions, free of charge apart from Inclusiv, can take a 6-week class in learning how to make consumer loans as well as commercial loans in solar energy. That's pretty freaking awesome. And free, a favorite word for small credit unions. You can proceed, the Zoom meeting will close, and then you just go back to how you got in here. You go to the title of the plenary and click on that, and you will get back that. So at 3:45 Eastern time, you can get back on. So thank you so much. Everybody have a great day. Be safe.
Thank you.
Robin, there was a
Bye.
request to put your email in the chat for anybody if they want to grab that before we end the session.
Oh, yes, ma'am. I will do that right now. Hopefully I can spell my name correctly. Oh, looks like I did. MarisolCU.org. It's out there, guys. Great session.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you for having us.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, everybody have a great rest of the day.
You too. Pleasure to meet you, Robin.
Nice to meet you guys too. Good session. I think people
Great
got
session, great session. Thank you.
Yes, good session.
Andrea.
We made compliance fun.
I always think that compliance is fun. I have a ball with compliance.
I appreciate that, Andrea. Yes. we
I
are.
do.
It is nice
Right.
to have that.
I'm
Okay,
gonna
take
end the
care.
session now. Thank you.
All
That
right.
was a great session. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.